Now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Lydia X.C. Brown. Lydia is a disability justice advocate, organizer, educator, attorney, strategist, and writer. Their work has been largely focused on violence against multiply marginalized disabled people, especially institutionalization, incarceration, and policing. They have worked to advance transformative change through organizing in the streets, writing legislation, conducting anti-ableism workshops, testifying at regulatory and policy hearings, and disrupting institutional complacency everywhere, from the academy to state agencies and the nonprofit industrial complex. I will post the link to their website in the chat. With that, I'll turn it over to Lydia.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be joining you all today virtually. I am broadcasting from Washington, D.C. I want to begin by asking each of you, wherever you are at, to take a moment of pause, to listen to what your body-mind is telling you about where you are, about what it is that you've carried into your space with you today, to tune in to whether your body-mind is telling you that you are hungry or thirsty, you are enthusiastic, you are bursting with eager anticipation, you are satisfied and content, or you are struggling, you are in mourning, you are frustrated, disappointed, you've come to this space with rage, with anger, you've come to this space with weariness, exhaustion. Let's take a moment, just a few moments for each person, to ground ourselves so that we may meet ourselves where we are at. Thank you for doing that with me. I begin every facilitation in the same way, with this request that we take a moment of pause. Because for me, that is one micro practice, an example of how we do disability justice. All of the work that I do is steeped in that framework. And disability justice offers us many things. It is a framework, it is a set of principles, it is guidance, it offers us opportunities, it helps us imagine our future, and it gives us the blueprint for the kind of world and society that we are working to build and sustain for generations to come. Disability justice is at its core the art and practice of honoring our body-minds, of honoring the body-minds of those who are around us, who live alongside us, work alongside us, or struggle alongside us. And it is also an expectation and an offering for us to honor our own body-minds. When we live in a society that tells us that there are only certain ways that body-minds ought to exist and to take up space, and that if we do not conform to those expectations, then we are the problem. We are defective, disordered, or deficient. Disability justice offers to us that all of our body-minds deserve to exist, to be present, to take up space, that all of our body-minds are worthy, that all of our body-minds belong, that there is no wrong way to have a body or mind. When we talk about what it means to live at the intersections of disabled and trans identities, we're addressing a particular subset of the disability community, one to which I belong, that faces marginalization even within an already marginalized community. In the trans community, disabled people face intense and profound ableism. And in the disabled community, likewise, trans people often face deep and profound anti-trans oppression and violences. I want to start by going over some basic terminology, since many people who are present may not be familiar with this, and others of you may know this already. So if this is deeply familiar to you, you can feel free to kind of tune me out for the next couple of minutes. That's okay. I won't be offended. For those of you for whom this is a bit newer terrain, I want to start with elucidating the differences between sex and gender identities. When people are born, in our society, the United States, where we live, most of us anyway, I'm here in Washington, D.C., babies are usually assigned a sex upon birth or even before birth if they are tested prenatally to see what chromosomes they might have. And on some combination of chromosomes and genitals, most people will assign a baby to be either female or male. And if the baby is born with ambiguous genitalia, or with what we will call an intersex condition, then usually that baby's parents and or medical personnel will decide to pick one between female or male and say, well, this baby should be raised as a female or should be raised as a male. And in the trans community, we refer to that determination as a sex assigned at birth. When we use the terminology AMAB for the captioner, that is spelled A-M-A-B, we're referring to a child who was assigned male at birth, A-M-A-B, AMAB. Similarly, when we use the terminology AFAB, spelled A-F-A-B, we're referring to a child who was assigned female at birth. And I'm saying child in this context, but that terminology can also apply to adults. But usually this takes place during either pregnancy before the fetus becomes born as an actual baby, or shortly after birth when a baby has escaped a uterus and is now out there in the world. Tangent, I send birthday cards to people that say, "Happy Escape from a Uterus Day." It's one of my favorite things to say because it always gets a laugh. And I unfortunately cannot claim credit for that. Credit for that goes to the guy behind the oatmeal cartoons. When we talk about children being assigned female or male at birth, what typically happens is that that child is raised, if assigned female at birth, to be a girl and is expected and assumed and predicted to be a girl. And if the child was AMAB, the child is raised to be and expected, assumed, and predicted to be a boy. If, as that child becomes old enough to start thinking about themselves, past the stage of infancy, and at some point in their life decides, I'm not what I've been expected to be. So they were assigned male at birth and they realize maybe around the age of 5, or maybe not until they're 25 years old, I don't think I'm a boy. That doesn't fit me. Then we would refer to that person as being under the transgender umbrella. That particular person may not use that terminology. They may not claim that specific identity, but as a descriptor, just describing who that person is and how they are experiencing the world, we would say that they are transgender because the gender that they're realizing they have, even if they don't know the specific label that makes sense to them, and even if they never decide on a specific label that makes sense to them, it does not correspond with what they were assigned at birth. The same thing is true if an AFAB person decides at some point, actually, I'm not a girl, I'm not a woman, or I'm a girl but only sometimes, I'm not a girl all the time. We would also say that that person falls under the transgender umbrella. If, on the other hand, someone who is AMAB grows up and during their whole life is pretty sure that they are a boy and then a man, and that they are a boy or a man pretty much full time, that they are definitely not something in between or something other than, and they're definitely not a woman or a girl, then we would call that person cisgender. We spell that C-I-S-G-E-N-D-E-R. Sometimes we say cis for short, just as we sometimes say trans for short. That's always used as an adjective. A cisgender person is one whose gender matches the sex that they were assigned at birth. So anybody who is not transgender is generally considered to be cisgender. And again, not all people who are cisgender might use that word. And in large part, that's often because many people who are cisgender are simply not familiar with that vocabulary. Someone doesn't have to use the particular terminology in order to be recognizable or describable as belonging to a particular category. And so at its core, when we talk about gender, if someone's gender matches what they were assumed to be from the moment they were born, then they're probably cisgender. And if someone's gender does not match what they were assumed to be when they were born, or only matches with it occasionally or part of the time, then they are probably transgender. Within what I've been calling the transgender umbrella, There are a multitude of specific identities and labels that we could discuss. We could literally spend hours describing the different terminology that is used among trans communities. We don't have hours, so I'm not going to spend hours going over every possible iteration of different terminology that is used and describing every minute difference. But I will pause for a moment to acknowledge that in the trans community, as in any other community or group, there is not always a consensus as to exact definitions of particular terminology. And of course, every individual person doesn't use the same language or terminology, even if their experiences might otherwise be similar. So as a caveat, the language and the terminology that I'm using in this presentation and that I'm using in this brief moment of describing some definitions is meant to be an overview and an opening, but it is not necessarily a definition that 100% of people in the trans community would say, I agree with that, or would say, I agree with all of that. But I am attempting to provide an overview that at least will give you all a lay of the land, and that is broadly applicable, although it may not be specifically applicable to every individual person. So I hope that that makes sense. Oh yes, and I see a question about slides. I do have actual slides that have some of this terminology on them, but my laptop broke last week and the location that I am physically in has no functioning Wi-Fi, so I was not able to share those slides at this time. However, I can make them available later once I'm back at my office and have access to a computer. I see a question as to whether cis is a prefix or an acronym. It is a prefix. It comes from the same origins as trans. So trans from the ancient Greek means across or to move between. So when we talk about a transcontinental flight, it is one that crosses from one continent to another. So a transgender person is one that we understand that terminology as meaning moving from one understanding of gender or assumption about gender to another understanding of their own gender that is different from that. That's where that terminology comes from. In an older mindset, a term that had been used in the past widely for transgender people is the word transsexual. And today, many transgender people would find the word transsexual to be outdated and offensive. However, there are still some transgender people who describe themselves as transsexual, and there are other transgender people who make that choice specifically because they use the word transsexual to indicate that they have chosen to undergo gender confirmation surgery. The outdated or older terminology for GCS is sex change surgery, but we would usually say it's gender confirmation surgery instead. A cisgender person using that prefix from the Greek is one that has stayed where they are. So someone who, again, their gender matches what they've been assumed to be for their life is someone who is cisgender. So neither the terminology transgender nor cisgender are meant to have a value basis. We use that terminology to indicate that one is not normal and the other one is abnormal, nor do we use it to mean that one is good and the other one is bad. So just as I might say you're either a tall person, a short person, or an average height person, and most of us understand that terminology to be value neutral, I'm not saying normal height people and then the people who are deviantly tall and deviantly short. We would say you're tall, short, or average. And those are just meant to be descriptors to categorize where people's height might be, to categorize people's relationship to their gender, which becomes relevant in a society in which there is widespread interpersonal, systemic, and structural discrimination, what we call oppression, on the basis of gender and on the basis of relationship to one's gender. It is important to understand that there are, broadly spoken, two general categories of people in regard to gender, which are those who are cisgender, whose gender more or less matches what they've been assumed to be, and those who are transgender, whose gender more or less does not align with what they were assumed to be, what they were assigned at birth from the moment that they came into the world. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. So a few other terminology items. The term transmasculine broadly refers to people who are often assigned female at birth and who identify as more masculine, whether they are in fact a transgender man or simply masculine of center. That's another term that you'll often hear used in the trans community. The other the sister terminology to that, for lack of a better terminology, is trans feminine. Someone who is trans feminine is often someone who is assigned male at birth, and that person may be a transgender woman, or they may otherwise be what we call feminine of center, even if they are not outright a transgender woman. When we use the description transgender man, we mean somebody who is a man, but was probably assigned female at birth. This person may also have been assigned as intersex. They may have been born intersex, and perhaps they were in fact not subjected to coercive surgery at the time that they were born. Unfortunately, coercive surgeries are a widespread and pervasive human rights violation on intersex children that happen globally. When we say someone is a transgender woman, we mean someone whose gender is woman, and they were likely assigned male at birth, or perhaps they were born intersex. Another piece of terminology to understand is non-binary. Non-binary can mean many things. It can mean a person whose gender is none of the above. It can mean a person whose gender is a mixture. It can mean a person whose gender is a third gender. It can mean a person whose gender is mostly man, but sometimes woman. It can mean a person whose gender is mostly woman, but sometimes man. And it can mean a person whose gender changes, and we call that being gender fluid. So non-binary encompasses a multitude of gender experiences and gender identities. That's the terminology that describes me. And how I understand my gender is basically none of the above. When you think about putting on a shirt or a pair of pants or a pair of shoes, and you've ever put on a piece of clothing or a pair of shoes that just did not fit you, it wasn't even necessarily that it looked bad per se, but it didn't fit. It was too big. It was too big in the shoulders. It's too tight around your ribs. It just doesn't fit right. That's what it feels like when people describe me as being either a woman or as being a man. It's not a deep moral violation. It's not the same thing as someone saying, wow, Lydia is this evil, like horrible person, but it feels wrong, like I'm putting on the wrong piece of clothing, because neither man nor woman fits my experience of myself. My gender is none of the above. If someone says Lydia is a woman, it just feels inaccurate, just as if they said Lydia is from Nigeria, which is also inaccurate. There's nothing wrong with being from Nigeria or with being a woman. However, neither of those things are true about me. The term trans by itself is frequently used, and we use that in addition to saying transgender, and there are a variety of personal or political reasons that might be the case, but it's used as an adjective. So we don't use that as a noun. We don't say the transgenders or a transgendered person. You are transgender as a person. You are a trans person. Those are all terms that we might use. So when we talk about disability and being trans, there are a number of barriers that disabled and trans people face. In the disability community and in the trans community, we are often faced with the presumption of incompetence, and this is particularly virulent in the worlds of mental health and developmental disabilities, where we are presumed to be incapable of making decisions, let alone of understanding our place in the world, who we are, and what our relationship is to the world around us. When the presumption of incompetence enters into our lives as people who are both disabled and trans, it means that we will often not be believed if we decide to assert anything about what our gender is like. So for example, a trans woman with developmental disabilities in a group home may be refused permission from the staff at her group home from wearing clothing that she feels makes her feel more like a woman, because they will say that's cross-dressing and it's inappropriate. And you don't really know what you are. You can't be a transgender person, even if the people at the staff might otherwise consider themselves supportive of the LGBTQ community. In another example, a person experiencing a mental health crisis who goes to the emergency room because they do not wish to act upon suicidality that they are experiencing may face civil commitment and admission to the secure psychiatric unit in that hospital. And upon admission, that person, who might be non-binary, will most likely experience all of the personnel, the nurses, the doctors, and the other staff at the hospital repeatedly referring to them by a legal name on their paperwork that is not the name that they ordinarily use, refer to them using gender pronouns that do not accurately reflect the gender that actually makes sense to them, and further, seek to question and interrogate them about being transgender and specifically being non-binary, as though that itself was a cause or underlying contributing factor to their suicidality, when in fact they may have been experiencing suicidality either for reasons that are completely unrelated to their trans identity, or, is often the case, they may have been experiencing suicidality because they've been surviving ongoing abuse from an intimate partner or from a family member, or perhaps both parents, if they've had both parents, who are denying their gender identity. Those are both not abstract examples, but they are stories that have happened to people who I personally know and who I've worked with and whose situations I've been asked to intervene in. When you are disabled and you are trans, you face risk of being placed under guardianship, of being subjected to what's called a Rogers guardianship, or a treatment order by the court that you are required to take certain psychiatric medications. And that if you do not comply with that order, you could face more coercive and involuntary interventions as a result of that. And for those who are both disabled and trans, if you are placed under guardianship, your guardians now control your access not only to the potential of gender confirming surgery if you are experiencing dysphoria and you wanted to seek gender confirming surgery, but also even to a basic support group. Because if the staff at your group home, which is run by an agency that holds guardianship over you and is your representative payee, does not want you to go to an LGBTQ support group, and you are also reliant on that staff for your transportation because your disability makes it difficult to use transportation on your own, or you live in a rural or suburban area, then you'll never be able to even go to a support group of other trans people just to talk about what it's like to figure out your gender and what it means to live in a world where to be transgender means you are subjected to discrimination and prejudice and oppression because the staff decided that it was inappropriate for you to go. They have control over your life. That's what guardianship does. One of the Kennedys, and I honestly don't remember which one, I think it was Robert, but one of the Kennedys famously said about half a century ago that guardianship is the death of civic personhood. Under every state in the United States, the District of Columbia, and our territories, there exists a concept known as plenary guardianship, and in some states it's called conservatorship. A guardianship effectively strips away a person's political and civil rights because they are deemed to be legally incapacitated. That is, they are deemed by a legal adjudication to lack the mental capacity to care for themselves, to survive on their own in the world, and to therefore make decisions of any kind whatsoever over their lives. In some states, it is possible to carve a limited guardianship where a person is generally under guardianship, but with certain specific rights preserved. But overall, when you are placed under guardianship, you lose the vast majority of your rights, whether that is the right to vote, the right to marry without written permission, the right to make medical decisions, the right to make financial decisions, the right to enter into or exit from contracts, and so on and so forth. Famously, Britney Spears was placed under guardianship called conservatorship in California. When she was placed under guardianship, it was following an acute mental health crisis in which Britney Spears had been involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital following a public mental breakdown. After she had been involuntarily committed, her father, or perhaps it was her stepfather, not recalling which, filed an emergency petition along with staff from that hospital to place Britney Spears under a complete conservatorship. That petition was approved, and Britney Spears, although a celebrity famous around the world, regardless of everyone's personal opinion of her and whether or not we like her music, she has remained under guardianship ever since. She is not allowed to have any control whatsoever over any of her own medical or financial decisions. None of it. And if it can happen to somebody like Britney Spears, who is functionally being abused in public, Think on what happens to disabled and trans people, especially disabled and trans people of color, disabled and trans low-income people, and disabled and trans people who are immigrants or belong to minority faith communities who do not have access to even a portion of the public platform or resources that somebody like Britney Spears, at least allegedly, has some access to. When disabled and trans people are facing the prospect of guardianship, there is almost never a public campaign to remove or to remove the guardianship, to take it away. There's almost never a public campaign to reinstate that person's rights. There's almost never a public campaign to ensure that that person is able to make even the most basic decisions for themselves, whether it is to be able to decide what they wear, what they eat, where they go, or as large as what they wish to do with their body, what it is they wish to do with their legal documentation. Disabled and trans people further face barriers within the trans community because many people in trans spaces not only operate programming and events that assume that trans people as a default are able-bodied and neurotypical, that is, that trans people are not coming in as people with mental illnesses or with developmental disabilities, let alone both, and so create often spaces, organizations, and programs that are largely inaccessible, that may be extremely harmful, and in some cases outright abusive. But also, there is a trend in LGBTQIA communities, whether that is the trans community specifically, or other communities under the LGBTQ umbrella, of resisting the medicalization of trans identities, which is to say, resisting the notion that to be transgender means that we are mentally deviant or defective and in need of being fixed, rehabilitated, or cured of being trans, by insisting that trans people should be validated and affirmed in society because we do not, in fact, belong to the category of people with mental illnesses. As the saying will go, being trans is not a mental illness. There is nothing wrong with us. And while that statement is true in both of its pieces, that to be trans is not the same thing as having a psych disability, and that there is nothing wrong with being trans in the world, the way that that framing operates is to imply quite strongly that the reason we are okay and that there's nothing wrong with us is because we do not have mental illnesses. And the implication of that statement is that therefore those people who genuinely belong in the mental illness bucket, the ones who are accurately and correctly labeled as being mentally ill, those are the people that really are scary and dangerous and unstable and crazy. Those are the people who ought to be subjected to medical and state surveillance and mechanisms of control. Those are the people who need to be managed. Those are the people who do not know what is for their own good or what is best for them. Do not lump us in with those people. And that is fundamentally a dehumanizing act. The belief that we are only allowed to lay claim to our own humanity at the expense of others. I talk about this frequently in a variety of contexts, and I describe it as an investment in disavowal. We are taught that we can only claim our humanity and access to civil or human rights or some measure, some small measure of social justice if we do so at somebody else's expense. And at the end of the day, who that harms are people who are at the margins of the margins. In this case, people who are trans and who have psych disabilities will be harmed and are harmed the most from assertions that to be trans is valid and valuable because it is defined as against not being mentally ill. For those of us who live with both experiences, and that means myself, I'm speaking as someone who is trans and also has psych disabilities and developmental disabilities. What that means is that I am constantly asked to choose between aspects of my personhood. I am allowed to exist in trans space if I repudiate my disabled personhood, or I'm allowed to exist in disabled spaces if I repudiate my trans personhood. But I am never allowed to simply be me in all aspects of my identities and experiences. When disabled people are also trans, we face particular challenges with how gender and disability interact. When we talk about ableism, which is a word referring to oppression of disabled people, that is a system of power relations and values that are imbued into those power relations that separate people into those whose body minds are considered healthy, functional, sane, whole, and stable, and those whose body minds are instead deemed as deficient, disordered, defective, sick, and deviant. We are taught that being disabled in itself is both defeminizing and emasculating. Disability detracts from femininity under a regime of ableism because it prevents somebody who is a disabled woman from embodying the characteristics that patriarchy ascribes to womanhood. Disability under ableism is understood as detracting from a woman's beauty and sexuality. She cannot be fully a woman if she is disabled. At the same time, disability is emasculating because it detracts under ableism from what patriarchy ascribes to manhood and masculinity. A man cannot be virulent and strong if he also is disabled. And so disability, on the one hand, detracts from the aspects of gender that are ascribed to and expected of people who even fall within the binary of man and woman as the two genders within a binary system. But it also accentuates those characteristics that are used and weaponized against us. Disabled people are routinely ascribed simultaneous hyper-sexualization and desexualization. Hypersexualization happens particularly with Black and brown disabled men. Under a regime of racism and white supremacy that ascribes criminality to Blackness and brownness, a Black or brown disabled man existing as someone living at that particular intersection will be rendered as a hypersexual predatory threat, particularly to white non-disabled women. And simultaneously, disabled people who might otherwise have experienced privilege or power due to other identities or experiences will often experience a desexualization. That is a presumption that by necessity, all disabled people are incapable of having sexual desires, of acting on sexual desires, of making sexual choices, or of engaging in consensual sexual relationships. Of course, these ways in which ableism operates against disabled people that ultimately translate into even further violences against disabled people who challenge gender and sexual norms to begin with, because we are queer or trans or both. Will harm us all. When we talk about ableism and the lives of disabled people, we're describing a system that ultimately devalues all of us. It devalues our bodies and minds because we do not conform to the expectations of what body minds are supposed to do, of how body minds are supposed to act, and of what our place and our role is in society. When we challenge that in more than one way, because we not only are non-normative due to being disabled, but we are also non-normative due to being trans, will face particular forms of marginalization and oppression that those who only experience marginality on one axis will not. Understanding that, what we call intersectionality theory, builds off the work of the scholar Kimberle, Kimberle Williams Crenshaw. A Black feminist attorney and scholar, Professor Crenshaw first publicly described intersectionality in a famous paper from 1994, in which she discussed the impact and the nature of oppression that targeted Black women, an experience later described by scholar Moya, M-O-Y-A, Bailey, as misogynoir, spelled M-I-S-O-G-Y-N-O-I-R. Professor Crenshaw described this oppression as particular and peculiar. It was not simply adding 1 + 1, but it was recognizing that Black women's experiences could not be described or understood solely through the lens of sexism, nor solely through the lens of racism, but rather as a specific experience created by compounded and amplified sexism and racism operating in tandem, and incapable of becoming disentangled. Since Professor Crenshaw described intersectionality in this way, practitioners, community members, and others at the front lines have expanded greatly upon the theory of intersectionality, which is spelled INTERSECTIONALITY. When we talk about intersectionality today, we are referring to a way of understanding what happens when any forms of oppression collide, compound, and amplify, because they are affecting people who live in the spaces between and overlapping oppressions. One of the people participating just posted a link to that paper, which is titled Mapping the Margins, and then the subtitle, which is quite long. It is listed on one of my slides that I do not have with me. That you will have those later, I promise. When we talk about intersectionality in the context of understanding how to best support disabled people who are also trans and perhaps also live with other forms of marginalization and oppression in our lives, what we can give ourselves the opportunity to do is to make space for better supporting and amplifying the work that we already do. So let's talk about some specific strategies for doing that. For those of you who are participating in today's webinar, who are not disabled, or who are cisgender, or who are both non-disabled and cisgender, one of the most important things that you can do for our community is to listen to what we are saying about what we need, about what is harmful, about what is helpful, about what works and what does not work. So often, so many experiences of toxicity and harmful relationships could have been easily avoided if people in our lives, whether our social workers, our personal care attendants, our case managers, or our neighbors, listened to us when we said, please do not make comments about what my voice or face sounds like. Please work really hard to remember the new name that I've chosen for myself and use it when you're talking about me. Please use my correct pronouns, not just when I'm in the room, but when I'm outside the room. Please help me find out what resources I can get into that are in a way that I understand, so I can learn about myself and learn about other people who also struggle with being told what they should be like, what they should look like, and what they should dress like that do not match my experiences. Except that we will always be uncomfortable. And that's true whether you're here and you're trans or you're cis. We're going to be uncomfortable because when we're approaching and learning about forms of oppression that affect people around us in ways that it may not affect us personally, even if we belong to some of those communities, it is easy for us to become defensive. It is easy for us to assume that being asked to take a pause and to reevaluate and adjust our interaction or our behavior or an accusation on our morality or on our character or on our decency. And that may not be the place. That may not be the case. Instead, someone may have decided, I trust you enough to share with you that this is uncomfortable for me, or that this is re-traumatizing for me. Instead, someone may have trusted you enough to say, this is who I really am, and I want to share that with you. It is okay to ask questions. It is also okay with whom are not involved in an immediate situation. It is okay to ask what is the best way to support a particular person, because what each person needs and what is helpful to each person is going to look different situationally and relationally. When we are up the power gradient from people that we may be supporting or working with in a professional context or in a service delivery context, there's an additional dynamic of power in which those who are in the professional or the service delivery role also are marginalized yourself, automatically are granted power legally, politically, and socially over those who are receiving services or who are the clients or the patients or the consumers. It's imperative and incumbent upon us to always be asking, what am I doing to leverage my power to be supportive of this other person? When we ask what constitutes an effective support, an accommodation, or a service, the answer always needs to come down to, does this in fact support that person's goals for themselves? Does it enable them to live authentically and freely? And does it follow their lead? Or is it something that I've assumed is in somebody else's best interest? Is it something that I have guessed is probably something that they want and would perhaps be non-intrusive or helpful, but may in fact not be? When we look at what it means to support somebody in understanding their own gender, if they are in a process of discovery and questioning, or they are in the process now of what we call social transition, which is acknowledging what their true and authentic gender is, perhaps choosing a new name, perhaps choosing to adopt different gender pronouns than the ones that they were using previously, perhaps informing people that they wish to be seen and talked about differently than they had been previously. How can we ask ourselves what it means to be supportive? So some specific tips for those working in the service delivery context. If someone tells you, I am now using a new name, or I am now using a different set of pronouns, ask that person, do you want me to correct other people if they use the wrong name or pronouns? Because sometimes the answer is yes, please correct. Sometimes the answer is no, I'll do it myself. And other times it might be, it's not safe for you to use my chosen name and new pronouns anywhere else but between you and me. So ask people, because even if it seems supportive, it may actually be endangering a person and you don't know until you ask. And we will always appreciate if you check in. If you say to us, where would you like me to use your name? Is there any situation in which I should not use this name? Is there a situation in which I should correct other people, either with you present or when you're not in the room? Ask. If someone is expressing interest in trying a type of clothing or a type of activity that they have not previously been using or doing, you can encourage that person. Make it clear that it really is an option, that you will support that person in looking into and exploring what will feel right and better for them, for their body, and for how they spend their time and what activities they are doing. One thing that we talk about in the autistic community in particular is the importance of enabling opportunities but removing pressure. And this language comes from the Autism Network International, which was founded in the 1980s as the first organization run by and for autistic self-advocates. The idea is that autistic people, and this can apply broadly to those with other developmental disabilities and those with psych disabilities, thrive best when we have opportunities enabled in which to socialize and form relationships and participate in activities that may come with a barrage of sensory stimulation, but are not pressured to do so. There is no explicit or implicit obligation or expectation that we ought to be engaging in that activity or participating in that space. And we thrive best in that scenario because we are allowed to set boundaries for ourselves and we are allowed to explore on our own terms. This is also true across the board. When we talk about how to support people who may be exploring and questioning their own gender identity, they've realized, whether or not they're using this specific language, that the gender that they were expected to be based on their sex assigned at birth does not match their experiences. And they may or may not know for sure, perhaps they do not, what their actual gender is. But they are seeking to explore and figure that out. And the best way to do that is A, to be able to have contact and opportunities for contact with other transgender people, with organizations that provide support to transgender people, and with resources that are about being transgender and what it is to live as a trans person in the world, but not pressure to either forsake those resources and connections in favor of just living the way that you're supposed to be based on your sex assigned at birth, or pressure to instantly choose and to immediately begin undergoing one or another form of transition. We all move at our own pace. Some trans people, upon realizing, oh wow, holy shit, I'm trans, immediately jump into the deep end and are immediately like, I know what I need to do, 1, 2, 3, lickety split to transition. And others may take months or years to realize fully what makes sense about who they are and what their relationship is to their gender in the world. And the best thing that other people in our lives can do to support us is to listen, to affirm, to validate, to offer opportunities, and to assist us in accessing those opportunities and resources. And that's really what it boils down to. Don't make assumptions, ask. And even if those assumptions are meant to be positive and supportive, ask, enable, support. I hope this is helpful as a brief overview. I am available for additional questions. I think we have until, how long do we have until? We have another 10 minutes or we have longer?
We do have another 10 minutes.
Great. So I want to leave this time for questions from you all that I'm happy to take. I was asked if I shared my pronouns. I did not. I use they, them pronouns or just my name. There are only 3 pronouns that I hate, which are he, she, and it. You can use other neo-pronouns for me, like z, zie, or zem, xem. But usually I just go by they and them. Let me look. It looks like there's a fair number of questions or comments that are in this chat box. I'm looking to see them. Someone asked me about the slides. I answered the question about what cis is, and okay. So if there are other questions, I believe that you need to send them into the chat box and make sure that they're being sent to all panelists, and then I will see those. I will share a brief plug for one of the organizations that I work with. I serve on the board of the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, for whom I also do public policy advocacy. And one of AWN's projects, Divergent, is focused on bringing disability into feminist spaces and feminist activism. AWN also does quite a bit of work around supporting autistic people who are trans. We are a quasi-volunteer organization in that we work to pay people who do work for AWN, but we have no full-time staff. And we are doing a lot of programming online and in face-to-face space to support autistic people who are marginalized in a variety of ways. And if you are interested in supporting that work, you can donate to AWN at awnnetwork.org. So that website will have 2 N's in it. I have 2 questions here. One question is, you touched on this briefly, but could you please speak for sexualization of disabled folks? So when I talk about hypersexualization and disability, I'm referring to a trend by which people with disabilities are either treated as hypersexualized, and there's very little in between. On the hypersexual end, this is often also racialized as well. As I mentioned, that Black and brown disabled men in part take the brunt of this, but it can also apply to disabled people of other races and of other genders. Hypersexualization of disabled people happens when disabled people are assumed to have this never-ending extreme sex drive that we are into, extreme amounts of sex. There's a word for that that I'm not remembering, that refers to a something maniac. There's a word for that I just am not thinking of at the moment, that refers to a person who is hypersexual. And sometimes there's another ableist overtone to that on top of the nymphomaniac. That's the word. Thank you. There's a additional layer of ableism to that, in addition to how that is at its basis just a little bit dehumanizing, and a little bit meaning, a lot to begin with, that because disabled people can't possibly have meaningfully reciprocal sexual and romantic relationships because, we're disabled and therefore incompetent and undesirable, we just want to have sex with anything that moves because we can't get it anywhere else. And this is really harmful to disabled people, regardless of their actual experience of libido or sex drive, because knowledge, our autonomy, and our individual diversity of experiences, and our capacity to make different decisions about what our sexual activities and sex lives ought to be like. The next question is, do you have a reference for an article that shows the continuum of gender identities? A really great 101 resource, which of course is not perfect and it's not all comprehensive, but it's really great just as a baseline, is the Gingerbread Person resource. There's a diagram and a really great graphic out there for that. If you look up the latest version of the Gingerbread Person, that's a really great place to start. The next question is, do you have some good resources on talking about trans identities with people with intellectual disabilities who may need visual support or other accessibility considerations for comprehension? There is a really fantastic resource that was just put out by, I totally know this, the National Council on Independent Living, NICL, and it's an easy read guide related to sex, sexuality, gender, and gender identity. It also is not perfect and does not cover literally everything, but nothing will. But that's one good place to start, is NICL's resource. You can also, I think that the Rainbow Support Group in Massachusetts, led by Pauline, Pauline, Bosma, BOSMA, may have some resources specific to the intellectual disabilities self-advocacy community as well. I hope that helps. I think we have time for maybe one more short question, if there's one in the works.
Lydia, there is one under the question and answer, and it asks, are there resources for individuals who are exploring their identity but struggle with communication skills? I don't know if you saw that one.
Sorry, I see that now. I would refer you as well to the resource from NICL, and perhaps, again, check with Pauline Bosma in Massachusetts. I also think that there may be some resources that have been put out by Nahama, spelled N as in Nancy, E-C-H-A, M as in Mary, A, Nahama, Samit, S as in Samantha, A, M as in Mary, M as in Mary, E-T, Mooring, M as in Mary, O-R-I-N-G. Nahama Samit Mooring may have some specific resources.
Well, we thank you for your time and attention during this hour. Before we open the floor to questions, we'd like to make you aware of our next webinar, which will be held January 30th from 2 to 3 p.m., and that is Eastern New York time, with presenter Shane Neumeyer. Shane will give a presentation on the state of mental health and disability, historical injustices, and present-day concerns. The registration link will be available on our website, mhddcenter.org, and announced through our newsletter.
Thank you again so much for having me. It's been a pleasure being with you this afternoon, and I appreciate you sticking through with me despite my technical problems. You're welcome to get in contact with me as well. I'm going to type my email address into the chat box. If I can spell. That assumes a lot.